This video covers Module 2 Part C, Survey Research. In this video I'll provide an introduction to survey research and talk about a number of the issues that we commonly encounter when constructing surveys and also when implementing surveys. In AMB 201 we deal quite a bit with survey research, and in Module 3, which is the next module, we devote quite a bit of time to survey design, thinking about things like the sample that we choose and the measures that we choose to incorporate in our surveys. So today's lecture will provide a nice foundation for that. As part of the lecture, we'll talk about different ways that surveys can be classified, so specifically in relation to time dimensions. Are they implemented cross-sectionally or longitudinally? And we'll also talk about the differences between modes of distribution, so whether surveys are conducted face-to-face, over the phone, by paper in the mail, or in the online environment. We'll go through different pros and cons of each of those and some of the trade-offs that you often have to make when choosing one method over another. As a starting point, it's useful to be aware that the technical name for what we commonly refer to as a survey is actually a sample survey or a sampling survey. This really differentiates it from what we term a census, which is where we would ask a question or a series of questions of everyone within our population of interest, or everyone within the target population. With a sample survey, we might be interested in characteristics of that wider population, but we only ask our questions of a sample. The idea being that if that sample is really representative of the wider population, then we only need to ask our questions to that sample to be able to infer something about the wider group. That's why you often hear a lot of discussion when you're talking about surveys about the need for a representative sample, or whether the sample was representative. We often think about surveys as being in written form, so paper-based surveys or online surveys, but they also include spoken surveys. So essentially interviews or spoken interviews. That means that the qualitative interviews that you've conducted or will conduct for AMB 201 very much constitute a type of survey. They can include both qualitative and quantitative questions. So we have qualitative surveys and also quantitative surveys, or surveys that have mixes of those types of questions. Qualitative surveys typically have open-ended questions, so fields where people can elaborate and give additional information about the way they want to answer a question. But then quantitative questions are where the questions are fixed across people throughout each of the surveys, but the response options are also fixed. So everyone has a limited number of options that they can choose from in order to respond. It might be along a continuum, for example. They're not free to elaborate. What this does is provides a lot of standardization, which allows us to, for example, take averages across people and conduct statistical analyses on the responses that people have given. So it's really quite valuable. And that's the main focus that we're going to have when we talk about surveys in AMB 201. You'd know from surveys you've done in the past that questions can pretty much relate to anything. As a researcher though, you will typically group questions into different classifications. So typically we have what we term demographic questions that relate to things like people's gender or their age, their ethnicity, their educational background and so forth, something that tells us about the person. We can also ask a range of categorical type questions, so questions where people classify themselves into different categories. Are they a Ford owner? Are they a Toyota owner? Are they a Holden owner? So the factual type information. If we're doing more theoretical research, we can also ask about a range of things such as people's cognitions, their affect and their behavior. So cognition referring to things like people's thoughts, their beliefs, their memory, affect relating to people's attitudes, their emotions, and then behavioral questions relating to their past behavior and also their future behavioral intentions. So what they might have bought in the past versus what they might intend to buy in the future. When we're conducting this more theoretical research, we will typically ask people to respond along a continuum, such as the ones shown here. We term these a Likert scale, where people indicate the extent to which they agree with a statement made based on a 1 to 5 point scale or a 1 to 7 point scale anchored at disagree and agree. That's a Likert scale. We'll talk a lot more about that in Module 3. The value of having people respond along a continuum like this is that it allows us to see variation across people and come back and talk about how a certain construct or a variable changes across different types of people or different groups. And it allows us to conduct statistical analyses, so we can think about running a correlation with something like that. If we only had people responding yes, no, we can't really come back and conduct a correlation with that. We want to see people vary along a continuum. So you see a lot more of these scale items when we're doing theoretical research. The value of running a survey is that most people understand what a survey is. So if you provide someone with a paper-based survey, you don't need a lot of explanation. Most people understand what they have to do. Contrast that with something like projective techniques that we talked about in the qualitative lecture, where you have to provide people with an explanation of what they need to do. So that's a real value of running a survey. Compared to something like qualitative interviews, they're generally low cost and you can get data from large samples very quickly. Because of that, we can also have a lot more geographical coverage. We can send those out across the country to urban areas, rural areas, regional areas. We don't have to necessarily be there as a researcher. So there's a lot of advantage in doing that. Provided your survey has been set up appropriately and you're sufficiently trained in data analysis, then analysing the data is really quite straightforward and fast. Compare that to something like a qualitative study where you have to manually sit down and draw out themes. And we've got this idea of findings being generalizable. That means that once we've collected data from a survey, from a sample of people, we'll typically be able to generalize or infer the conclusions we've arrived at apply to the wider population, or they generalize to the wider population. So that's a real benefit of a survey when we have a representative sample. That's much more difficult with qualitative research because we use such a limited sample or a small number of people. We don't always know if our findings are going to generalize to the wider population. The other advantage of a survey is very much that they're standardized. So not only is it useful that we have standardization in that people know what to expect and how to complete the survey, but we often have standardized questions across surveys. So researchers in different fields, in different countries, for example, can often employ the exact same questions so that we can make comparisons across pieces of research. That also can give us a lot more confidence in the questions that we ask because we know other people have used these in the past in order to measure a variable or measure some sort of construct. Where can we find those questions? We don't want to necessarily develop them ourselves and then have to justify asking given questions. So you can often find a lot of questions that have been developed by other researchers, and you can check out various psychometric properties of those questions within aggregator websites, but also in what we term marketing scales handbooks. So these are large volumes that are published periodically that provide us with an overview of a whole range of constructs, questions that have been asked in order to measure those constructs, and tell us about who has used those in the past. So let me show you how you can access those. If you go to the library website, and you could certainly go along to a library in person, but it's just as useful to do that online. It's a lot easier to do it online. And you search for a term like Marketing Scales Handbook, you'll get a whole range of these appear in your results page. You click on the ebook are available online, and it takes a little while to show up because they are quite large, so I've loaded that beforehand, and you can go to the online version here. So this is a Marketing Scales Handbook from a few years ago. I'm not quite sure of the year. If we click on the table of contents, such as the ones here, and there are actually thousands of these across all of these handbooks. So we might be interested in a measurement of anger or a measurement of anxiety or anxiety with technology. We might be interested in attitude towards commercials and how people have measured that in the past. We would hope to use those same scales that they've used so that we can start to make comparisons. Critique whether their research is appropriate and whether it applies in the context that we're looking at. So if we just have a look at one of these, we go to page 52 to look at the attention to commercials. You can see a description of that scale, where it's been developed in the past, so by Jin in 2004. We've got a couple of points here about the psychometric properties of that, and we'll talk about those in a second, and then the actual scale items that were used. So these three items were asked of participants in those studies that have used those questions before. If you go up here, it may say something like these questions, there were 3 questions and they were asked on 7-point scales. So it gives you a lot of detail about that. And you can see that with a whole range of questions. So here, attitudinal strength, and you've got the questions that were asked for that. So check out those scale handbooks if you ever want to have a look at that. They're very informative when you're putting a survey together. In terms of drawbacks or potential drawbacks to surveys, we need to think about the validity and reliability of the questions that we ask. So validity and reliability are terms that always come up in relation to quantitative research, so surveys and experiments. So you'll hear these throughout the remainder of the course quite a bit. Validity refers to the extent to which the questions that we're asking truly tap into what we claim that they're tapping into. So are they truly asking about the construct or the variable that we're saying that we're asking about? So here you can see 3 questions that relate to measuring purchase intentions, and it's purchase intentions towards Samsung. So an individual respondent will be presented with these 3 statements and asked to indicate the extent that they disagree or agree with that statement. So I'm motivated to buy Samsung products, I will buy Samsung products, and I will seek out Samsung products. Presumably if they rate highly on all of these, then we say they have high purchase intention. As a researcher, what you do to calculate a person's purchase intention score is go through and take an average of these 3 items, and the average might be 6.2, and you say their purchase intention is 6.2 on a 7-point scale. If you're questioning the validity of those measures, though, what you're really saying is, well, I don't know that those questions are really about purchase intention. Maybe they're more about purchase preference or brand preference rather than purchase intention. So when we're questioning whether or not those items truly tap into the measure, we're talking about validity. If you've ever sat through, say, a statistics exam and you felt that the questions were more measuring your maths ability rather than your statistical ability, then you're questioning whether that's a valid test for statistical ability. So we kind of do this quite naturally. Reliability is a little bit different. Reliability really relates to the idea of consistency. Is it likely that questions that we ask are going to be consistently interpreted in the same way across people, or is there going to be some varying interpretations across people? And if we were to take the survey twice, would we interpret those questions in the same way and give a similar response each time, which presumably we should. So take a look at the questions here that come out of something called an activity index, where we have questions like approximately how much TV have you watched over the past week? How much time do you typically spend at your computer during any given day? In an average week, how much exercise would you say you normally get? If you look at that and say, well, what are we classing as exercise? Is it anything that raises our heartbeat? Is it walking to the TV or walking to the fridge and back to the couch? Is it sport? Is it running around for at least an hour? What is it exactly? If people are interpreting that question differently and responding to it differently, then what we say is that question lacks reliability or may lack reliability. When we pose a question, we want it to be presented in such a way that everyone will interpret it the same way. And across time, we would interpret it the same way. You can see an alternative here where the researchers really been much more rigorous about setting up the questions. So here they're provided a description of what physical activity is, and then the questions are things like within a typical week, on how many days were you physically active for a total of at least 60 minutes per day. So they're being much more precise there in order to shore up that reliability. Validity and reliability we'll come back to quite a bit across the semester. Beyond that, we've also got issues of execution, and we'll talk a lot about these in Module 3. So how can we be sure that our sample is representative, or what things can we do to ensure that we get a representative sample? How big should our sample be? Obviously, if we're interested in some characteristic within the Australian population, such as people's perceptions of Qantas, just asking a small number of people, 2 or 3 people, we're probably not going to get a really reliable estimate. We want a large enough sample to ensure that the attribute that we measure in that sample is it tells us something about the wider population. And then we've also got this idea of response biases. So is there an issue with the way people are responding to our question that we may not be getting accurate responses? So are we asking questions in a way that lead a certain type of response that may give us a bit of an inaccurate result? We need to take these things into account. So I've put together a few different examples of challenges that you can often encounter when putting together survey research that you're probably already aware of, but it's quite helpful to see and get thinking about as we go through the content today. And when we get to module 3, we'll go into these in a lot more of a structured way, but this will give you a little bit of a taster. So people often respond based on things that are salient in their mind or that have occurred recently. So you can imagine if you've just been watching the news and you saw something about an airline crash, then doing a survey asking you whether or not air travel is safe, that's going to bias your response. So people very frequently think about something that's salient in their mind when giving a response. As a researcher, you need to be sure that you're not biasing people's responses by asking them questions at a time where they're likely to be influenced in that way. A good example that I saw where that was really quite apparent was in a Lateline survey, an ABC Lateline survey a couple of years ago, and this was with the during the time of the Trump election campaign, where Trump made certain statements and a group of people within the UK then petitioned the UK government to try to get Donald Trump banned from visiting the UK. And this was quite controversial, quite topical at that time, because they were essentially suggesting that a presidential candidate should be banned from going to the UK, which is quite unheard of. Lateline, during their program, having aired that story, then posed this question: do you think Donald Trump should be banned from entering Australia? And their results were very much in line with what you might expect given the story that was just aired. So 70% of people saying yes and 30% of people saying no. And I've actually got the news story here. So it was from the start of 2016, where you see the results down here and a few comments that people made at that time. So that result isn't really unexpected, given that the question was asked after a news story was aired about the petition in the UK. Had that question been asked after a news story about the value of free speech or the way in which people should have freedom of travel or something like that, the responses would be quite different, I would imagine. So you try to ask questions like that some time after people have been exposed, so you can get a more valid response. We often have this idea that if we're asking questions of people, that they will be able to give us a response. Often though, as I mentioned before, people can lack insight into their own behaviours, and they can lack insight into their own attitudes as well, and may not be able to articulate those things. And we have to be very mindful of this, particularly if we're expecting that people are going to be able to respond. So the example I've got here is, can you tell me how long you've spent online in average week, or say last week? If you haven't been monitoring the amount of time you've spent online, that can be a very tricky question to answer. The interesting thing with online surveys in particular is that if people don't know the answer or aren't able to articulate an answer, often we don't give them the option to not provide a response. Often you'll get a response like the one here if you try to skip a question saying that you can't proceed. We almost force people to respond even when they can't. The problem with doing that is that it can force people to improvise. So people will provide a response, and in some cases people will make up responses just because they're trying to complete the survey. So we as researchers need to be really quite mindful of that. The instance that comes to mind when I talk about that relates to some research that a colleague of mine was conducting a few years back, where what he was interested in was the recreational and adventure sports that people engage in when they go to New Zealand. So it was some tourism research. And in that research, a whole bunch of adventure sports were listed. So rock climbing, abseiling, and two were listed that most people, maybe not everyone, would have heard of. So zorbing and blackwater rafting. And what he found in that research was that younger people were more likely to say that they were likely to do all of these things, including zorbing and blackwater rafting. Older people were a little bit less likely, as you might expect. But then a question at the end that asked people to describe each of those activities showed very clearly that not everyone was aware of what zorbing was, despite having said that they would do it, and even fewer people were aware of what blackwater rafting was. So if you're unfamiliar with those things, zorbing, of course, is where people roll down hills or across fields in these big inflatable balls. And then blackwater rafting is rafting through underground caves. So instead of whitewater rafting, you're rafting through these caverns under the ground in the dark. So that's blackwater rafting. So people were very much improvising with their responses and saying what they would do despite not even understanding what they were responding to. So that's a real concern, especially if we then put a lot of confidence in those results. We've got this issue that people will often try to behave in or respond in a socially desirable manner. So people will often try to paint themselves in a positive light, and more so than what they probably should. We see this very frequently with health behaviors, exercise behaviors, eating behaviors, safe sex behaviors, driving behavior, and so forth, where people tend to respond a little bit more positively. It's common in almost all of us, but some people are extreme with it. And then linking to that idea of reliability that we talked about in the previous slide is that people can often misinterpret questions or interpret wording within questions in different ways. So they're essentially responding to different questions if you think about them like that. So how frequently do you engage in exercise? Well, what do you mean by exercise? Is it something very minor or something more elaborate when we're talking about that? So we want to make sure people are responding to the same question. And then this one's always a nice example. If you're daring enough as a researcher to put in a question like this, where you would hope that someone would indicate whether or not they're male or female or some other response there, I can almost guarantee you'll get a few very interesting responses, such as sex, yes please. I had one from a student once where the response they gave was only by myself. So again, people interpreting words in different ways means that the questions are going to be a little bit unreliable. All right, because of those things, what we say is when we collect data as part of survey research, there's always going to be some element of error. So we try to minimize this as much as possible, but it's always going to be present. And there are two key types of error that we need to be aware of. We go through this fairly extensively later in the semester, but I want to give you a little bit of an introduction today to get your mind going and also to provide a bit of context. So the two types of error are listed here. We've got random sampling error and systematic error. Let's go through what they are. Random sampling error is error associated with the fact that we've taken our data based on a sample rather than the full population. So if we're interested in study habits of everyone within QUT, then ideally what we would want to do is some sort of census where we look at everyone's study habits and we can get a really accurate idea of how people go about their study. If we draw just a sample though, we're going to get an estimate of study habits, but it's not going to be perfectly in line with what the full population of QUT would give. And that's simply because we're looking at a sample rather than a full population. So for example, if this is our population of interest and we only take a sample of these 6 people here, we're getting an accurate response, but it differs to the full population because we're looking at a sample. We call this random sampling error. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just because we're taking a sample. By chance, sometimes when we take a sample, especially if it's a smaller sample, that could be a very unrepresentative sample. We might be selecting people totally at chance or totally randomly, but just by chance we could get a biased sample. In this case, our sample is composed just of females, or it might be just young people in another instance. The way we can get around that, of course, is trying to implement ways in which our sample is more representative, and we can also increase our sample size. That can also help to reduce random sampling error a little bit. So random sampling error will come into play when we talk about our data analysis, but that's always going to be present whenever we collect data from a sample. The other type of error that we need to be aware of is what we call systematic error, and this is a little bit more problematic. So this is error associated with what we're doing as a researcher that's incorrect, or the way in which our respondents are providing their responses. So if they're using some sort of bias. So if you think about what we do as a researcher, perhaps we ask questions in a misleading way. Perhaps when we're coding up data, we misenter data. We would call this systematic error, especially if we're systematically doing it in the wrong way. So we're always accidentally, because of our typing style, hitting the button 6 when we should be hitting the button 7, for example, if it was a data entry error. We can can think about respondent error, where people might always tend to be providing socially desirable responses, or people might have an inclination to only respond with sevens on a 7-point scale, or ones on a 7-point scale, where they have a bias towards the extremes. We'll talk a lot about this later in the semester, but that's a bit of a primer. In the remainder of this lecture, what I want to do is run through some different ways of classifying surveys in terms of time of distribution and then also mode of distribution. If we're thinking about time of distribution, the two to be aware of are that we can conduct surveys as cross-sectional surveys and also longitudinal surveys. Cross-sectional surveys are where we conduct a survey once and we ask all of our questions at one point in time. Essentially, we're taking a slice of time. Longitudinal surveys are different. This is where we might run a survey at multiple points in time in order to see changes across time. A caution with cross-sectional data is that we need to avoid the temptation of making inferences about time-based changes or relationships that are across time. If we only have cross-sectional data, we can't make that conclusion. So for example, if you were Dell and you've just run an advertising campaign and you want to know whether or not it's effective, you go out and you measure people's attitudes toward Dell. You can't necessarily say that those attitudes have improved because of your campaign, because you need time-based data in order to make that inference. A good example is shown here, and hopefully you can see that on your screen. What we see here is that we've got age groups along the bottom of the screen: 12 to 17, 18 to 32, 33 to 44, through to 73 plus, and it appears that whatever we're measuring here is lower and lower across those older age groups. If you're looking at something like recreational sport, and you collected people's likelihood to engage in recreational sport at these different age groups, it would appear that young people engage in recreational sport most, and then as people get older, they engage in it less and less. We can't really make that inference though if we've collected cross-sectional data. It may be that this age group always participated in recreational sport at these low levels. We don't know because we've only collected data at one point in time. To drive that home, imagine that this data here related to internet usage data. Right? And here we see that 93% of 12 to 17-year-olds report using the internet frequently, for example, and in these older groups, there's a much lesser usage rate. If you were to use that same logic, you would say that as people get older, they use the internet less. We know that that's not the case because it's more of a familiarity and a technological acceptance issue here. So that it wouldn't make sense to make that time-based inference there. Whenever we've got cross-sectional data, we can't make those time-based inferences, even when it's tempting to do so. With longitudinal data, there are also problems. So we often think about longitudinal data as being the ideal, or what we would want to collect in order to make inferences about changes across time. So why don't researchers do it more? It's actually quite difficult data to collect because it's difficult to retain access to people across time. You can imagine the SONA studies that you've completed as part of AMB 201 now. If I were to try to collect longitudinal data based around that and ask you to complete those studies again in a year, many people probably wouldn't do that or be available to do that. So getting that longitudinal data is really quite difficult. It can be quite costly in order to access the same people multiple times. One of the problems with longitudinal data is that when we ask people questions, the same questions across multiple points in time, the very fact that they've done a survey earlier on or been asked a question earlier on can impact how they respond later. So for example, here you've got data that shows people's awareness of Subway corporate social responsibility initiatives in the financial year 2010 to 11, all the way through to financial year 2016 to 2017, and it appears that awareness is increasing. If this is measured across the same group of people across time, so it might be for shareholders, it may actually be that asking people about corporate social responsibility activities in these early years makes them more aware of or more sensitive to noticing what Subway does in terms of corporate social responsibility. So this increase isn't necessarily due to Subway doing more or promoting more about its CSR initiatives, this increase may very easily be due to the fact that people are just becoming more sensitive because of the survey itself. We call this a testing effect, and we have to be really quite mindful of that with longitudinal data. It's also possible that there's just natural variation across time that's not due to anything that we might think of. We often think about longitudinal data as being at least 2 points in time. It can be very helpful to take longitudinal measures multiple points in time to see how the general trend is across a longer period than just 1 or 2 years. So here you can see data that looks at or shows people's social networking site usage across time, and it's from 2006 to 2013. So if you're aware of when Facebook started to become popular, it was around this time. And you can see here that this younger age group, 18 to 29, are really taking it up very quickly, and it's plateauing from about 2009 to 2013, so relatively flat, whereas across time these older age groups are still increasing. If by chance we had only taken 2 time points, and we might have taken 2009 and 2011, what we would say is that there's no increase for this younger age group, and there's no increase for this 50 to 64 years age group. That would give us a very different picture to what we're seeing here, where we've got multiple time points. Or if we were really unlucky and to take these 2 measures here, it might suggest to us that younger people are actually turning away from social media because we've got a little bit of a decline there. Very important to take multiple points in time if we're looking to show these trends across a longer period of time. These variations here can be due to a range of things. It might be due to the time the survey was taken. It might be due to government initiatives around that time, or it could just be due to random sampling error. The people that constitute our sample are creating a little bit of a blip or a deviation in that data. To finish off with, we can also think about different ways in which surveys can be classified in terms of the way we distribute them to our participants. So are we distributing them in a face-to-face capacity, so a door-to-door survey? I'm sure we've all had people come to our door and try to conduct a survey in the past. We can also think about another common technique which is called the intercept technique, or a mall intercept. This is where someone might stand in the street, not necessarily in a mall, and just intercept people as they're passing and try to get you to fill out a survey. We've got phone surveys and also self-administered surveys, so paper-based surveys that are delivered in the mail or delivered online. And we can talk about pros and cons of each of those. So if you think about face-to-face surveys, we generally say that these have a very high participation rate. So you might think of yourself turning someone away at the door, not wanting to complete a survey, but if you think about the number of people that a door-to-door survey researcher would encounter, the participation rate is really high compared to something like a paper-based survey that people can just tend to throw away. So when we go to someone's door, they often feel much more compelled to take part rather than just to turn the person away. It can be valuable because the researcher is there to explain questions that a respondent might not understand, and they might be able to provide visual aids and prompt or probe for additional information, explain questions that people don't understand. The problem is that they can be really quite high cost, so you have to send a researcher out to individual homes, and you're not getting a whole lot of data really quickly compared to something like a paper-based survey. The researcher is present, so we have this idea of an interviewer bias. The very fact that a researcher is standing there waiting for someone to provide their responses can bias types of responses that people give. People can tend to display social desirability a little bit more strongly. And we also have this issue that not everyone tends to be home during times when researchers are collecting data, so we miss out on a certain group of people. We might not get full-time workers as well represented within our sample as possible, and we also miss out on people in regional or rural areas because we often go to streets or busy streets in urban areas in order to increase our sample size. Can think about different types of phone surveys, and the ones that are probably important to be aware of are described here. CATI and CATS. CATI refers to computer-assisted telephone interviewing, and this is where people might sit in a call center like you see here, and the interviewers or the people conducting the surveys phone people at home, and they're essentially reading out a script from the computer. The value of that is that it's quite personal, so people feel quite happy to give answers to a person over the phone, but the fact that they're reading a script from the computer makes it very standardized, so it's really quite useful in that way. CATS refers to computer automated telephone system approaches. So this is where a person is not involved at all. So it's a computer that makes the call, and it's a machine that reads out questions to people and takes their responses. So as you can imagine, respondents are less likely to take part in that. We're much more happy to hang up the phone on a machine rather than a person. But the value of it, I guess, is that a machine is going to be much more standardized, and it's a cheaper way to collect that data. Can be useful if it's a satisfaction survey at the end of a call. So if you've phoned up a customer helpline, you might be asked to stay on the line to make some responses in terms of the level of satisfaction with the service you received. You wouldn't want to do that with the person that you've just interacted with, so it might be useful in that setting. It doesn't tend to be used overly much in Australia at the moment. It's very dominant in the US. I lived in the US for a few years, and when I bought a car there, I was just inundated with these CATS calls. So popular in some areas, hasn't quite taken off in other areas such as Australia. We also have to be mindful that there is legislation in certain countries. So within Australia, we have the Do Not Call Register. The Do Not Call Register was introduced in Australia in 2007, and this was around a time when there was a lot of telemarketing calls occurring, and people were getting like 12, 20 telemarketing calls a day. It was really getting out of hand. So the government introduced this Do Not Call Register that you could put your phone number on, so that any telemarketers had to first check whether or not numbers were listed on there before calling. And if they called a number listed on the register, then they're liable for a fine. Be aware though that market research is not telemarketing. So telemarketing is selling something. Market research doesn't have that commercial sales element to it. Around that same time though, because market research was getting a bad rap because of telemarketing, what was introduced was what's termed the calling standards. And the calling standards specify times at which market researchers can call and when they can't. So you can see that on the screen here. So researchers shouldn't be making calls on Saturdays or Sundays before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. or weekdays before 9 a.m. or after 8:30 p.m. So there are restrictions there. In terms of phone interviews, data can be collected very fast. It's really quite low cost. If you think about voice over internet lines now, phone calls essentially can be made for free. So it's quite a cheap way to do it. We can get good geographic coverage compared to something like face-to-face interviews. It can lack representativeness in that only a certain type of person tends to respond to those calls. And if we're only calling within a certain time frame, then we may not get late night workers, for example. With mail surveys or paper-based surveys, these are really quite low cost, so it's only the cost of an envelope and a piece of paper and the cost to post that out to people. We have good geographic coverage. The value with a paper-based survey for respondents is that we tend to get lesser social desirability. So because it's anonymous, or provided it's anonymous, people are quite willing to give their genuine responses. In terms of difficulty, there is a low response rate. It's not unusual to get 3 or 4% of surveys returned with a paper-based survey. So people are quite happy to throw that in the bin or discard that compared to something like a face-to-face survey where people may feel more compelled. So they generally have to be fairly short in order to maintain people's attention. Online surveys, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, so this might be provided via a web page or sent out via email. Very low cost or almost no cost apart from your time putting them together, because emails are essentially free. We've got great geographic coverage. We can send surveys out Australia-wide or even worldwide. We get very fast responses. When we send out surveys here in Australia, we can very easily get 2,000 and 3,000 responses overnight. Because it's online, it can be quite valuable to include links to help explain things to people, or rich media content such as videos. We do have to be mindful of legislation though. If we're sending surveys to people, these have to be people who've signed up to receive surveys. So in Australia we have anti-spam legislation, which means that we can't send these sorts of things to people who haven't opted into it. We do have this self-selection bias issue where people more willing to or more interested in a topic are those more likely to take part, and that that can bias our responses. People are happy to drop out. It's easy to close down a web page. And the other thing we have to be mindful of when we're putting these together is that very often people are using the web via differing platforms or differing browsers. So we have to go to considerable effort to make sure that our surveys will display properly on the different browsers available, but increasingly also on different platforms. So some people will respond to your survey on a desktop computer, others on a tablet computer, and others on a mobile phone. So we have to make sure that our surveys are going to display appropriately on all of those. One thing that a lot of the online survey producers are doing now is on their platforms providing users or researchers with a view of what the survey will look like on a desktop computer as well as a smartphone. So this is really quite handy. So I opened up previously this demonstration on a survey that we've got together, and this is what it essentially looks like, in that this is your desktop preview for a survey, and then over on this side, you can see exactly what that will look like on a smartphone. So there are a lot of mechanisms in which you can check that renderability issue as well. In terms of overall choice of method out of face-to-face surveys, paper-based surveys, online surveys, or phone surveys, there's no optimal method, and it's always going to depend on who you want to access as your respondents, the time and the budget you have available. There are, of course, trade-offs. If we have limited funds, then we may not be able to have face-to-face interviews. If we want a wide geographic coverage, again, we may not be able to have face-to-face interviews. If we want to access older groups of consumers, we may have to go with paper-based surveys as opposed to online surveys to get a representative sample. So those things need to be taken into account. It really comes down to the research design you're trying to implement. So in this lecture, we've covered survey research and gone through different ways in which it can be classified, gone through the pros and cons of those, and we've touched on this idea of response biases, reliability and validity, and they're going to be key in Module 3, so keep those in mind. The next lecture covers experimental research.